All right, show me a sign, chapter 14. A few days later, Papa tells me that Andrew Noble has taken a census of the different towns on the island. After officially counting all the people on Martha's Vineyard, Andrew has decided to focus on Chilmark. We have the highest number of deaf residents. I hadn't noticed that before. He concluded that 1 in 4 residents of Chilmark is deaf, compared to 1 in 6,000 on the mainland. You might have knocked me down with a feather. Are we that far apart? There's only a small strip of Atlantic Ocean between us. Papa also told me that Andrew's been collecting soil from our land and water samples from our wells. What does he plan to do with these findings? What will happen to our island if he does find the source of our deafness? I imagine our shores will be overrun by observers, stomping through our farmlands, asking questions. Caravans of explorers will arrive to visit the land of the deaf. We have no leopard skins or ivory tusks. What trophies can they take with them? But isn't that what the first white settlers did to Wampanoag? Reverend Lee reminded us in a sermon that the earliest contract resulted in the Wampanoag men being captured and sold as slaves in Spain. I feel less impressed by our forefathers, even as I cherish our island. I met Nancy on the high road near the parsonage on our agreed time. She looked at me and she frowns, raising her eyebrows and snapping the fingers of both hands the way a hearing person might click their tongue. "Your frock," she signs. "What's wrong with it?" I counter, smoothing my hands over my skirt. "It's too bright," she says. "Don't you know anything about spying? You have to merge with the landscape." I grab the edges of my cloak and I pull them tightly around me. I have no choice but to wear all my winter garb on this frosty day. "I'll just keep myself hidden," I tell her. She looks unconvinced. On our hands and knees, we duck behind the stone wall and wait. Mama will sigh when she sees the dirt on my clothing, though I've been this way my whole life and she's never grown used to it. As we hoped, Andrew Noble exits the parsonage and, paying us no mind, strides confidently down the high road, carrying his black satchel. Nancy raises her eyebrows at me again, and she signs the word. "Bag?" "It's his equipment," I reply. I'm sad for a moment, thinking of George. He collected things in his pockets, and he brought them home to examine into the kitchen table. In Andrew Noble, I see what could have been. Professional and scientific. I see what he could have been. Professional and scientific, but never as ill-mannered. "He's interested in facts," Nancy claims, and we both snicker. We crawl along for a little way, Nancy peeking her curly head up over the wall every now and again to track him. I tell myself that I will not make light of Nancy's spying efforts in the future. Andrew Noble stops on the other side of the road, placing his satchel on the stone wall. He takes out a small shovel and pail, and he digs up dirt and puts it into a glass jar. We watch him do this at different locations, each time placing the glass jar into his bag. But when he uses a paring knife to take a sample of the bark from an apple tree, Nancy is so indignant that I have to grab her and hold her back. In the distance, I see Andrew's schooner against the bright autumn sky and gray sea. Has he really been in Chilmark less than a week? A schooner is a boat. It's a small boat. Nancy stops suddenly and points. Ezra Brewer is standing in the road smoking his pipe. Nancy turns to me. "Perfect," she signs. "Let's go stand with Ezra Brewer. Sometimes the best spying can be done in plain sight. Keep your eyes open." Ezra Brewer is watching with open curiosity as Andrew takes the samples of sand and soil. He removes his pipe and shakes his head and puffs out his lips like a horse snorting. When we join him, I rub my fingers together, making the sign for dirt. "Do we eat it?" I ask Nancy. "You walk on it, same as me and Papa and Ezra Brewer, yet you here." Ezra Brewer rolls his eyes. "That man might as well investigate whether the Archangel Gabriel blows the deafening trumpets into the ears of selective infants on the vineyard." So they're making fun of the fact that he's testing all the soil and water and sand, even though, like, Ezra's a hearing person and he does the same things that the deaf people do. I giggle. Ezra Brewer blows an imaginary trumpet into the air, and Nancy jumps, scowling slightly. She's frightened of him, whether she would admit it or not. I fear Andrew heard the discordant sound. Hopefully, he'll think we're playing a game rather than watching him. As the three of us continue to follow him, we sometimes mimic his movements. He stoops to dig clay out of the ground and put it in a bucket. The ground is still wet from Sunday's rain, and he makes his britches muddy. His strides are long, and when he slows, we talk together, pretending that he is not our main concern. I think Ezra Brewer enjoys this game. I fear Andrew will turn around and confront us. How could I explain without seeming like a fool? I'm sure he would tell Mama that I was acting rude and childish. Rounding a bend, there are a handful of people who make us feel less conspicuous. Andrew approaches the Reverend sister-in-law, Mrs. Lee, who's signing in the road with Mrs. Butler. Mrs. Lee seems to recognize him a moment too late to escape. She tries to avoid him, but he's already saying something to her, removing his hat in a greeting. Mrs. Lee is hearing. I'm inclined to believe that at that moment she wished she wasn't. Mrs. Butler turned away with a sour look on her face. Nancy edges forward and molds herself to a tree so that she can interpret for us. Ezra Brewer and I pretend to sign a conversation while eyeing Nancy's interpretation. Mrs. Lee's youngest son, Ben, is stomping in a puddle. Nancy signs. He's asking her if her child is hearing. Suddenly, Mrs. Lee looks as if she might smack Andrew Noble. What has he said? I look to Nancy, whose cheeks are coloring deeply. He asked her if her stays were of severe tightness while she was with child. Nancy explains, and Ezra Brewer howls with laughter until he chokes on the smoke from his pipe. So he's asking her about her pregnancy, which is like a huge no-no back in the day. Like, you didn't talk about that kind of thing. When Mrs. Lee and Andrew Noble turn to look at Ezra Brewer, Nancy signals for me to run with her behind a bush. Why are we hiding? I sign. He already saw us. Exactly. He won't expect us to follow him. It's the perfect cover. This way we can see what he does next. He probably thinks we just went off on our way, she replies. We peek out from behind the bush. She's right. Andrew is continuing up the high road. What is he up to now? I don't like this guy.